Hey guys, in this tutorial, you're going to be learning everything you need to know about assistant function calling so that you can get started using this technology in your own apps. And in this tutorial, you're going to be learning how to build this website, which teaches you how to create assistants, chat with them, and then use function calling to get recent stock prices. And because you're awesome, I'm going to be giving away all the source code to this application. All you need to do is go down and click the link in the description below. And if you wouldn't mind hitting that like and subscribe button on the way down, it'd mean a ton to me. All right, but let's get back to function calling. So first thing first, what is function calling and how does it work? Well, simply put, function calling allows AI to intelligently convert our human inputs into JSON objects that we can then pass into our functions. As programmers, all we need to do is describe the requirements of our functions, and then AI will do the rest. Function calling works great in a bunch of different scenarios, but the three most common scenarios you're going to use function calling are going to be extracting data. Basically, we're going to pull out a few keywords from a sentence or a user query. The next one is going to be when we want to pick which function to call. And what I mean by this is we can actually give our AI a bunch of different potential functions that are used inside of our application. And this AI will actually pick which function is the most relevant to a user query. So if we have a customer database and we pass in the query of, hey, who were our 10 most recent customers, our AI could actually go in and find that we have a find customers query and then actually pass in, hey, get the 10 most recent, and it will actually go ahead and call that function for us, which is pretty super powerful. And the third thing is when we want to generate or find data. At the end of the day, this is still an AI and it's a chat-based application. So we could have it do things such as like finding the 3 most popular Christmas songs, and it would return us to those, a string of those, and we could actually pass that along to our function. So those are 3 of the most common use cases. And now that we've kind of gone over that, let's actually dive into our application so we can see function calling in action. All right, so welcome to the application where we're going to be creating assistants, chatting with them, and then using the function calls to actually go off and get stock prices. What you'll notice is I've designed the UI of this application to match the assistant flowchart created by Assistant AI. This chart is super important because it shows us exactly how assistants work. So what we're going to do is I'm going to walk you through this chart and our application at a high level at the same time, so it'll hopefully all make sense. Then we'll actually take a deep dive into the code afterwards so everything will click. And if you still need extra help when it comes to working with assistants, don't worry, I've already made another assistant crash course video where we go into much more deeper understanding with creating and editing assistants at a high level. Definitely check out that video if you're still confused after this. Okay, so let's go ahead and start going through this application and seeing how everything flows. All right, so the first thing we're going to do to get all this kicked off is we are going to create an assistant that comes with some pre-trained instructions and also contains all of our function schemas. So whenever I click create, what's going to happen is you'll see that we get a new assistant. And just to show you that this is actually working, if I head over to OpenAI and look at my assistants and refresh, you can see that we just created a stock info assistant. And just to like dive into this a little bit deeper, you can see these are our pre-trained instructions. And like I mentioned, it already comes with all of our functions. So if I look in here, you can see that this is our schema for the function that we want to generate information for, our get stock info function. Basically, this is everything that you need to know about it. Okay, cool. So now that we have created our assistant, what we want to do next is create our thread. And a thread is nothing more than a fancy way to store all of our messages between us and the AI. So whenever I click create thread, you're going to notice that we have a new thread. Then what we can do is actually start populating this thread with messages. So in our case, I'm going to go ahead and say, hey, please get me the stock info for Tesla, Apple, and Nike. Great. So what that's going to do is then go off and add this message to the thread. Now, if you're used to ChatGPT, you might be like, hey, what the heck? Why is it not already working? Well, with assistants, you actually have to trigger a run. And runs are a little complicated, so let me walk you through what's going to happen. A run actually combines our thread and our assistant so that the AI can actually analyze all of the messages in here with the pre-trained instructions that come from our assistants. From there, it's going to go off and do its AI magic, generate a response, which would usually appear right here. However, we are dealing with function calls, so we need to take one extra step so that we can actually get back the responses from the AI so that we can pass those responses to our functions. Let me actually show you one extra diagram so this all makes sense. So what you're looking at right now is the run lifecycle. And to help this all make sense, I'm going to actually walk you through a normal run cycle. And then afterwards, we're going to go through it with a function calling example. Okay, so whenever we trigger a normal run state, what happens is the run will go into the queued state. And pretty much immediately after that, it will go to the in progress state. Now, while it's in the in progress state, it's going to analyze all of our messages in the thread, all of the pre-trained information from our assistant, and it's going to work on generating a response. Now, once it generates a response, what it'll do is add that message to the end of our thread. And from there, it will update the state of the run to completed. And we talk about this more in the crash course, but you actually have to constantly poll runs to try and figure out its state. So, every half second, you're polling the run to figure out where it's at. And once it's in the completed state, you can go back and look at the threads to find that updated response. So that's how everything works in a normal run lifecycle. Now let's work on function calling. So function calling is pretty much the same to start. The run is going to get queued and immediately go over to in progress, where we're going to perform more of our AI magic. But now here's where things differ. Once the AI knows exactly which parameters that need to get returned to your function, it's going to switch to the requires action state. And once it's in the required action state, it's going to already include all of the different parameters that we need to pass to our functions. And it's waiting on us to return the final results. So for example, if we were saying, what is the stock price of Tesla? What it's going to do is give us back the stock ticker TLSA, the stock ticker for Tesla, and it's waiting for us to pass over that stock ticker to our get prices function so that we can eventually pass back the current price of Tesla. So let's just say it was $100. What we would do is then pass back the $100 result to our run. That way it could store the result. And then from there, it goes from requires action over to completed. Now, I know this is kind of a lot of moving parts. Definitely working with function calls is a little bit more advanced than normal runs, but we're going to go through this in the code later. So you're going to see exactly how all this gets triggered step by step. But that's exactly how everything works in run lifecycles. So let's hop back over to the code so we can see this in action. So now that we're back in our application and know a little bit more about run state, it's time to actually go ahead and trigger a run and actually watch what happens. And it's important as we trigger this run to pay attention to the run state in the top right. This is going to show the current state of the run lifecycle. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and click create run, which will once again combine our assistant to actually perform, some AI analysis over all of our messages and our threads with the end goal of eventually we want to populate this stock prices. So I'm going to go ahead and click create. What you'll notice is in the top right, it's queued instantly over to in progress. And now what it's doing is performing its AI magic. And eventually it's going to come back with that requires action state. And once it's in that requires action state, you'll notice that this submit action actually populates. That way we can, pass along those stock tickers over to our function that we made earlier. So we're in the requires action. If we were to actually dive in the code, you would see right now all of these different stock tickers. But I'm going to go ahead and click submit action, which will populate this and move our run state over to complete. So let's go ahead and click it. And what this will do is add in all of our new stock prices with our new stock tickers. And like I said, this should go up to complete. It's just, it got triggered again. So that was my bad, but let's go ahead and dive into the code so you guys can actually see how each one of these steps are working so you can get more familiar with all of this. Like I said, we're in the completed step. All right, let's dive into the code. Hey guys, so welcome to the code base. This is the fun stuff that you've been waiting for. And what I'm going to do to help this all make sense is I'm going to run through the code base at a high level, and then we're going to speed through the generic assistant creation process, and then we're going to spend the majority of our time focusing on our function calling. Okay, so right out the gate, what we're using is a Next.js project that uses TypeScript. So what I've done to help make this more sense is I've broken up each of the major components on the website into their own file. So for example, you can see that I have an assistant and I also have an assistant component. And this assistant component contains all of the logic for creating new assistants and so forth and so forth. And I've actually done this for each one of the major portions of creating an assistant. So you can see that we have an assistant, we have a thread component, we have a run component, we also have a chat container, which is going to house our messages. And then afterwards, we have a stock price container, which is going to store our eventual stock prices. So that's everything on the front end at a high level. And then because we're using Next.js, we also have set up some of our backend API routes. And what you'll notice is for each one of these front end components, we have a matching backend component. So whenever we want to create an assistant on our front end, this actually gets triggered over to our backend assistant create route. So like I said, they're all matching. So now that you kind of understand a high level overview of the code base, what we're going to do is actually run through each one of these components super quickly and then spend the rest of our time on function calling. All right, so let's go ahead and get everything expanded and start working with our assistants. So let's walk through what's supposed to happen whenever I click create assistant on the front end. Whenever I click this, I would expect this create button to go into a loading state. And then from there, what I would expect is we would send off a request to our backend to create a new assistant. And we're obviously going to be using the OpenAI tools to create our assistants. And then from there, I expect the backend to return the newly created assistant to me. And once I have that new assistant, what I want to do is populate this new header up here to show our assistant ID so I actually know that everything's working properly. So let's go ahead and look at the code so we can see how all of this works. Okay, so first things first, I'm over here in the assistant front end component, and this is what's going on at a high level. So this whole component, all it's going to do is manage a button that you saw over here on our code base, create. And what it's going to do is whenever it's creating, we are going to put it as in the loading state. And then whenever it's not creating, we're just going to have this normal create button. But here's where all the magic happens inside of this handle create function. So let me walk you through what's happening in each step. So the first thing that we're going to do is send off a GET request to our backend to get a new assistant. And it's going to make a request to this route. And we'll look at this in just a second. But what I'm going to do when I get back is I know I'm going to get a new assistant. So what I want to do with this new assistant is actually set it so that we can access it in our header. Now, if this doesn't make sense, what I'm using is a tool called Atom or Jota Atom, and I'll actually show you what it looks like real fast. But this is just a quick state management throughout your application. And just because we have different components everywhere that need to talk to each other, it was a very convenient way to have a global state management. So that's what I'm using. So feel free to look at this in the code base when you have your own time. But like I said, this is more of a function calling tutorial, but this is how I'm managing state globally throughout our one-page application. All right, cool. What we're going to do is set that new assistant once we get it back so that we can populate the ID of it up here in the header. And then we're also just going to throw up a quick little success modal so the user knows that, yep, everything works and I have the new assistant. And then we're also just going to save it to local storage so we can refresh the application. And when we come back later, it'll automatically go ahead and actually show the assistant that we're previously working with so we don't have to create a new one each time. So this is everything that's happening on the front end. Now let's go over to the back end so you guys can actually see kind of the magic that goes into creating one of these assistants. So right now I'm at the API assistant create route, and let me walk you through what's going to happen. So as I mentioned earlier, we're using the OpenAI package. And what we're going to do inside of this is create a new assistant. And if you actually look in here, this is where the majority of everything that you saw earlier in the assistant playground, this is where all of that information came from. So let me walk you through what's happening. First off, we have to give our assistant some pre-trained instructions. So in our case, we're just going to say, hey, you're a professional stock analyst, and I'm just going to ask you for the current price of a stock. You will give me the price of that stock and provide me a link to the logo of the company. That way we can just add a nice little picture with each one of the stock tickers. Now here is where we actually go ahead and start to define our function schemas. And this part is actually very important. So what you'll notice is I'm putting each one of our functions as an object inside of this tools array. This tools array is what allows our assistant to basically look through and say, what possible tools do I have at my disposal to help me answer this user query? If you remember at the beginning of the video, I also mentioned that the assistant could potentially work with like 5 or 10 different functions at the same time and actually pick which one's most appropriate. Well, this is where you actually go in and define each one of those functions so that the assistant can look through them in basically its tool belt. That's how I like to think of it. Okay, cool. So let's actually look at the schema for the specific function that we're going to be working with today. Right out the gate, we have to tell this assistant that it's working with a function, and then we go in and define the function requirements. So in our case, we are calling the get stock info function, and we give it basically a quick overview of what this function does. And this is just a recap. Hey, give me the price and the link. And then from there, this is where we actually basically break down the schema of the function into its properties. So in our case, what we're expecting the function to do is have 4 different parameters. We're expecting it to have a symbol, a logo, a success, and an error message. And let's walk through each one of these. The symbol is going to be the stock ticker. So this is where we would convert Microsoft into MSFT. The next thing is the logo URL. This is where we would actually get back a a picture. And what's great about working with these functions is you can provide examples basically to help it understand more constraints, and it will follow those. So normally if you were just to say, hey, give me a URL to the logo, it might just pull a random picture out that's not really high quality. But if you go ahead and say, hey, I'm looking for basically all the logos that are stored on Wikipedia, it will in the future also pull additional thumbnails and logos from Wikipedia. So just a cool little tip right there. And then from there, what we're going to do is just add in a success message. If something goes wrong and it can't find a symbol, or we give it a bad stock name, it'll just come back with a failure. And then same with an error message, it'll just tell us, hey, here's what went wrong. So that's everything that happened in the backend route. And that's how we kind of set it up. And we're also providing it a model. It's important to note that only certain models actually work with assistants, but you can just look at the documentation because this is changing rapidly. And then what we're going to do from there is actually just return the assistant. So that's what you saw back here on the front end where we were pulling out the assistant from the data. Okay, so that was a lot to take in, but just to recap, we're going to create assistant. It's going to go to our backend. We're going to get it back and update our front end. So I'm just going to click it so you can guys see it in action. Bada bing, bada boom. We now have an assistant on our front end. So now let's actually work on our threads next. All right, so now it's time for us to start working with threads. And this is going to be super simple. All I expect to happen is whenever I click create thread, it's just going to show loading, and then it's going to update the thread ID up here. And we're going to have a new thread to work with inside of our application. So let's go ahead and look at the code, see how all this works. So first things first, we're over here in the thread component, and everything is going to be very similar for each one of these different assets when it comes to making an assistant. So in this case, what we're going to do once again is have a handle create function that's just going to create our new thread. We're going to need to be able to save the current creation state so that we can show the loading button. And then whenever we're done creating, we need to update the set thread so that we can show it up here in our header. Okay, cool. So let's actually look what happens inside of this handle create. First things first, what we're going to do once again is make a request to our backend, but this time we're going to try to create a thread. And what we're going to do is expect to get back a thread from this get request. What we're going to do is just like I said, we're going to show it up in our top header. Okay, cool. So let's walk back to the end of our backend code and see how this works. So this, like I said, is going to be super simple. All we need to do is actually come in here and once again use OpenAI and create a new thread. We don't even have to pass anything in. This is going to go ahead and create that thread, which is going to be our message container. Now, one thing you might be curious about is why am I not having to put any keys inside of my OpenAI library? Well, great question. If you actually go down to my .env example file, what you'll notice is I went ahead and actually provided the keys that you need to put in to run this application. So in my case, I already have a .env file which stores my OpenAI key, and this is the name that the OpenAI package is going to be looking for by default. So if you're able to come in here and put your own OpenAI key, you'll be able to access it automatically, and OpenAI will just work. So you can just head over to the the developer console inside of OpenAI and get all that set up and create a new key. All right, cool. So like I said, we're just going to create a new thread and return it to the front end. So that's pretty much how thread creation works. Now let's go ahead and move on to the next part, which is where we're going to start adding messages to our threads. All right, so now it's time for us to start working with messages. So let's walk through what we would expect to happen each time we add a message. So what I would expect is I should be able to come in here and type in a message like, hey, what is the price of Tesla? And then what I would expect to happen is whenever I click send, this message would be added to our thread. And from there, that message would persist. And the reason why that's going to happen is if you hop back over to this image right here, you remember that a thread is nothing more than a fancy place to store all of our messages between us and the AI. So that's exactly what we're going to be doing. All right, so let's actually come back over here and actually start walking through the code so you can kind of understand exactly what's going on. All right, so what I'm looking at right now is our chat container. So what you'll notice in our chat container, it's kind of getting a little bit more complicated than the last components, but let's walk through this part by part. So right out of the get-go, what we're going to do is we have a use effect. And the purpose of this use effect is to go off and fetch messages from our backend. And that's just because in here, what we want to do is be able to look back at our previous request because, we're making multiple calls to this function. So what this is going to do is actually check to see if we have a thread. If we don't, hey, there's no messages, we can't do anything. But if we do have a thread, what we want to do is start to fetch our back-end messages inside of our thread. So what we're going to do is make a request to our API message, and we're going to list those messages, and we need to pass along our thread ID. So let's actually go ahead and look at this call real fast. And I'm also going to pull up the documentation. So what you'll notice inside of all of these different functions that we're working with today, you can actually head over to the API reference and look at each one of the different assets. So a assistant, a thread, a message, a run. And this is where you can actually go ahead and see oh, that's exactly why he's doing what he's doing. So as you can see, whenever we want to create a message, we need to pass in the thread ID. And same thing, whenever we want to list our messages, we also need to pass in the thread ID so that we can figure out what we want to, we can basically say, hey, this is the thread we're working with. Okay, cool. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to pass in our current thread ID over to our backend call, and this is how we're going to grab our existing messages. But more importantly, what we're trying to do with this chat container is to actually send messages off, because this is how we're going to say, hey, I want you to send me the price of Tesla. So what we're going to do when it comes to sending a message is, once again, we are going to make a backend request to our API message, and this time create route. And what we're going to do is pass along the thread ID, and we're also going to pass along the text of our message. So let me go ahead and show you what this is going to look like. So if we go over to the create route, what you'll notice is this time we aren't working with a GET request. We're working with a POST request, and that's because we're actually passing along data this time. What we're going to be passing along is the thread and message ID. If the user didn't provide either of those, we're just going to send back a message, hey, you didn't send the proper information. But if they did send along the proper information, what we're going to do is create that new message that's going to be attached to our thread. And we're able to do that because we just pass in the thread ID, and then we pass along the content of the message. And like I said, if you go back over to the documentation, they'll give you a little bit more clarity on the exact schema. But the important part to look at is that, hey, we are the person who typed this message. So that's why we're saying it's of the role type user. And obviously this is where we're going to pass in our message string. Okay, cool. So what we would expect to happen back on the front end code is, once we send off that message as a post request, what we can do is actually get back a new message. And this message is going to be actually of a certain type. If you work more with the OpenAI docs, you'll actually see that this is going to be of type thread message. And then we can actually see the different types of roles that we were just talking about, user assistant. And the important thing that we want to do is append our new message to the end of our message array. And that's why if we come back up to the very tip top, what you'll notice is this is where we're storing our state for our messages, message, and our global message state. So that's pretty much how all of this works when it comes to adding messages. And what you'll notice that's going to be weird is, like what we talked about earlier, is whenever I click send. So I'll go ahead and do it so you can see what's going to happen. So I'm going to press send. We're sending it off to the back end, and then we're adding that message to our messages array. And obviously nothing's happened yet because we haven't ran the assistant. So that's what we're going to focus on next. But hopefully all this makes sense. And I do want to mention, if you guys have any questions whatsoever when it comes to this code, please drop a comment down below. I'd be happy to answer. Or I actually have a little link down below where you can schedule a quick call with me so we can review your code and figure out what bugs you're running into. So let's go ahead and move on to runs, because this is where we're actually going to start working with the function calling portion of this application. So all right, let's go ahead and dive in. So now we're going to start working on our runs. And before we dive into the code, I just want to mention the 3 things that we're going to work on. First, we're going to create a run. Second, we're going to start polling our run, which means we're going to consistently check on the status of our run state. And then third, we're going to submit our tool outputs to our run. So this is what we're going to do whenever we click that button. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into the first one, where we're going to create our runs. All right, so welcome to our run component. And this is actually just going to be this whole component right here from with the 2 different buttons in it. And this one's definitely going to be the most complicated component so far, but this is the one that's most important to actually working with function calling. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in. Right out the gate, what we're going to do is obviously usual. We're going to have our state management for storing everything about our runs. But most importantly, what we're going to start off with first is actually handling the create process for whenever we want to create a run. So let's go ahead and start looking at this code. So first things first, in order to create a run, we have to have a thread ID and an assistant ID. So we want to prevent a user from running this if they do not have that information. But if they have that information, what we want to do is create a new run. And if you remember from earlier, a run is nothing more than telling our assistant to look through our thread messages and actually generate a response, or in our case, generate some function outputs. So what's going to happen is we're going to create that run. And then what we're going to do is update our run status, and then we're going to update the run itself. And if you remember, going back to our initial run lifecycle, a run status can either be queued, in progress, requires action. And like I said, so those are like the different run statuses that we're going to be polling for later on in just a second. So what we're going to do is, once we update those objects locally and store them, what we're going to do is then start to poll our run. So this is what's going to happen in step number 2. So let's go ahead and start looking at what's going to happen inside of this polling function. So inside the polling function is every half a second, we're going to check the status of the run. So this leads us to the second part of our backend functions. So if we actually go over to our API, look at our runs, and we're going to start looking at our retrieve endpoint. What you're going to notice in our retrieve endpoint, what we need to do is pass in the thread ID and the ID of the run to continually grab the current run status. Just because, obviously, what we've said multiple times now, a run is going to start off in a queued state and then move over to in progress and then either go to completed or requires action. So that's what we're going to do. Every half a second, we're going to continually grab our run and we're going to update the run itself and the run status. What we need to do, if the run is canceled, failed, completed, or expired, what we want to do is actually stop polling. And what we want to do is fetch messages. And that's just because whenever the AI is done generating its output, we want to append the new messages to our chat. Or in our case, what we want to do is add those existing messages to our function calls. And this will make more sense whenever we get to the function calling section here in just a second. But that's what we're going to do. We're going to continually keep polling until we get to one of these completed states here. So hopefully that makes sense. So now what we're going to do is actually talk about the third step, which is whenever we get to the part in our code, whenever we need to submit our tool output. And to make this make sense, what we're going to do is actually hop back over to our front end code, and we're going to go ahead and create that run. So it'll actually make more sense. So I'm going to click create. What we're going to notice is we're going to move to the queued state, in progress state, and eventually we're going to go to that requires action state. Fantastic. So this is now we're in the third step of working with our runs, which is going to be submitting actions. And also you'll notice that this button didn't turn dark blue until we actually hit this requires action state. So what we're going to do is if we hop back over to our front end code, you'll now notice that we're inside the handles submit action function. All right, so this part is definitely the most complicated. So we're just going to take this slow and walk through what's going on. Sorry guys, after recording this, I realized that it actually makes sense to walk through this with a concrete example first before actually going off and diving into the code, just because this is by far the most complicated process. And it's actually best to actually go ahead and look at the actual documentation before doing the code. So what's going to happen is whenever a run hits the requires action status, it is our job to hit this submit tools output endpoint once we have required all of the answers to each one of the tool calls. And we have to submit all of our outputs in a single request. So in our case, just plainly, this means whenever we go off and get the prices for all of our stocks, we have to return them to this endpoint in a single request. Cool. So hopping back over to our code, this is what this means. Let's just say our run came back to us and said, hey, I need you to get me the tool calls for Tesla, Microsoft, and Apple. It is our job, our goal, to go off and fetch each one of these stock prices for the symbol. From there, we have to populate our output with all of the new stock prices. Because if you remember, we have to do everything in a single request. So as we're going through each one of our tool calls in here, it is our job to push each output to this tool calls output array so that in the end, we can pass back to OpenAI everything in a single request. And I know that's a mouthful. I definitely recommend watching this part a few times because this is the most complicated part. Whenever I was working with function calling, it definitely tripped me up. So no worries. And if you need help, feel free to drop a comment and I'll be happy to help down below. But let's actually walk through the code now that we kind of understand what's going on and actually look through what's happening inside of our front end code as well. What we're trying to do is we're trying to iterate through each of our tool calls. Well, where the heck are our tool calls? Great question. If you actually look inside of our logs and actually look inside of a run, if you go into the requires action object, go down to the submit tools object and tool calls, our tool calls is what's going to include everything that we need to go off and get an answer for. So remember, AI actually picks which tools to use. So in our case, our function has told us that we need to make tool calls to the get stock info function, passing in these parameters. In our case, the Tesla stocks ticker, and I guess it wasn't able to find a logo URL in this example, but keep this in mind. We're calling this function with these parameters. That's the whole goal from the get-go. So I should actually hop back over to our code now that we've made some concrete sense of this. So we did realize that now that we're iterating through each one of these tool calls, we're checking to see, are we using one of our functions that we've predefined? In our case, get stock info, boom. All right, we're using the right function. So now that we know what function we're working with, it is our job to pull out the different parameters that OpenAI gave us. So in our case, it gave us Tesla and a blank logo URL. Totally fine. So that's what we're pulling out. We're just going to do some validation right here, just in case something went wrong. But now that we know for a fact we have the proper symbol, what we're going to do is go off and get the price for this stock. This isn't really a part of this tutorial, but just know I have a backend route that uses FinHub library to go off and get the current stock price. So that's all we're doing. But what we need to do, let's hop back over to our run logic real fast. What we're doing, once we grab that stock price, we're going to generate our output for this specific tool call. So for this tool call, what we're going to do is eventually generate the Tesla price. And if you remember, going back to our instructions above, we need to slowly build up all of our answers and put them in a single output. So in our case, what this is going to do is have this array right here is slowly going to get populated with all of our stock prices. So it'll literally end up being something just like this. So Tesla is going to be $100, Microsoft, let's just say like 150. Apple, so forth and so forth. So that's what we're trying to do. And then finally, the final thing that we're going to do is once we have built up this array is we're going to come down here and we are going to actually submit all of our tool outputs to this endpoint. The reason we're doing this is because if you hop back over to our documentation, this is the function we've been trying to call the whole time. So I know this was a lot of work, but what we're trying to do is build up to call this. And if you look through this, all we need to do is pass along our run ID, our thread ID, and then the outputs for all of our stock prices. So let's actually head over to this endpoint right here and look at what's going on. We're just doing some simple validation, make sure that we passed along everything that we're supposed to. And then from there, we're just going to pass in our tool outputs to this tool outputs array. And that's literally, if you look at this is exactly what's happening. Our thread ID, our run ID, and all of the tool outputs for all of our different stock prices. So what I'm going to do is I think the run actually expired in our code. Yeah, the run actually expired. So what I'm going to pause it real fast, and then we're going to submit action and actually inspect what was going on. So I went ahead and submitted all of our different tool calls. Now I just want to walk you through basically what happened, because we're going through and we're logging stuff as we're doing it. So I want to walk through basically what happened so you can now see how we got to this final endpoint. So what we did is whenever I clicked submit actions, the first thing that happened is we were going to iterate through each tool call. And if you remember our first tool call, let's actually grow this so you can see what happened. So our first tool call, what it included was our Tesla stock price and the logo for it. And what we did from there is we went off and passed this stock ticker TLSA or TSLA over to our get stock prices endpoint. And what it did is, if you remember over here, so here's our tool call. We were in get stock info. What we did is we went off and passed our Tesla stock price to this endpoint. Everything was great. So we end up generating a new stock price object, and that's what's over here now. So you can see that our backend endpoint now gave us a new stock price for this stock ticker. Apparently Tesla is at this stock price at the end of the day. And it also passed along our initial logo, our Tesla stock logo as well. Great. So what's going to happen next is, if you remember, what we did was we iterated through each one of the tool calls. But in our case, there's only one. That's totally fine. But it's up to us now to actually look at this tools output array and pass it over to this endpoint. So in our case, if you look at our tools output array, you'll see that there's only one final output inside of this array, and that's just our Tesla stock price. We pass in the price of it and the logo. Yeah, price and logo. And it's also important that we also said, hey, which tool call did this correspond to? That's what was happening. And from there, what ended up happening is we passed this entire tools output object over to our backend, over to this route right here. So this is where it got passed in. And then from there, what we did is whenever our tools output finally gave us back an updated run object, we updated our run object, and this hopefully should have moved it over from requires action status over to our completed status that you see right here. And I know that was probably a ton of information. So what I want to do is just one final recap of what we did in this application, because you guys have crushed it so far. So what we've done is we've created a new assistant that's pre-trained with some information, and it also includes all of our different function schemas. From there, we've created a new thread. This thread is what's going to store all of our messages. Then we went over to our chat container and we added messages to our chat container. Once we've had those messages and our queries that we want to ask AI, we went off and created a new run. This run, what we had to do was we had to continually poll the run, because it's up to us to get the current run state that we have up here. Whenever the run state goes over to requires action, it was up to us to do three important things. First, we needed to iterate through each one of our tool calls. What we need to do with each one of those tool calls was go off and complete it. So in our case, that meant get the stock price. And then once we had all of these stock prices, we aggregated all of our outputs into one single array called our tool outputs. And then we passed our tool outputs back over to OpenAI so that we can move from the requires action state over to the completed state. I know that was a ton, but you guys crushed it. That's basically how you work with function calls and how you work with assistants in general. And once again, if any of this was kind of blurry when it comes to working with assistants as a high level overview, I have another video on that, which I'll link down in the description below. But that's pretty much a wrap when it comes to working with function calls. All right, so you guys should now be experts when it comes to all things function calling. But if you do need some additional help, don't worry. Please just drop a comment down below with any questions you have, and then I'll do my best to respond to them as quickly as possible. And also, just as a reminder, I have a link down in the description below with the entire source code from this application. So feel free to go in there and copy it and do whatever you want with this application. And then outside of that, I just want to mention I have a ton of other AI related content on this channel. So if you want to dive deeper into assistants, I have an entire crash course on that. And outside of that, if you want to take it to the next level, I have a complete tutorial which teaches you how to build a full AI SaaS application. So you're definitely going to check that one out as well. But outside of that, that's a wrap for this video, guys. So I hope to see you on the next one. See ya.